for a cannon demonstration, right?
Yes.
That's the plan. All right. Before we get going, let's identify our safety line, which is this white line in the grass. The best view is going to be right here. I highly recommend that you all, if you're interested, circulate in this general area. Take a seat in the grass if you want. You all have a lovely view from up there, so there's no need to get any closer. All right, so this year at Ticonderoga, we are recreating the events of 1774. In that year, this was a British fort, having been captured from the French in the conflict before, the French and Indian War. And in that year, we know that there were about 65 pieces of artillery that were at this fort. We know 35 of those guns were actually French, because they'd been captured with the fort in 1759 when the French failed to destroy a fair amount of their artillery. Now, after the French and Indian War, the British, they moved more and more cannon to this fort because they simply did not have the manpower to move lots and lots and lots of cannons out of the Champlain Valley. And so Ticonderoga becomes a depository for cannon that simply cannot be moved any further. Now, many of these guns, like our French 4-pounder here, were mounted on carriages, in embrasures, ready for action, but a lot of these guns were not. Instead, they have been left down by the King's shipyard or down by the water. Many of the guns that had been mounted, say along the ramparts here, well, they had rotted through their carriages, had pushed their way through their rotten embrasures, actually had tumbled over the cliff and were lost in the lake. Fair to say that this fort was not in any condition to withstand any kind of attack. Excuse me. Now, we know that all of these cannons, excuse me, were iron guns. The reason for this is that the French Ministry of the Navy and the British Board of Ordnance, they relied heavily on iron guns to arm forts and ships. The reason for this is that iron is relatively cheap to work with. It's abundant in the earth, it's easy to form into cannon, but iron is a very, very brittle metal, and this means that iron cannon, they have to be cast much, much thicker than their bronze counterparts, which are lighter. So this makes the cannon quite heavy, but of course, if it's on a carriage, in an embrasure, on the walls of a fort, or on the deck of a ship, that issue of weight is negated because it's not traveling with armies. Now, the way that cannon are rated or measured in this time period is by the weight of the cannonball that is fired from it. So like I said a little while ago, this is a French 4-pounder, meaning it fires a 4-pound iron cannonball. Now, the problem at hand is that the British and the French, they don't use the same system of measurement. The British system, it starts with a 3-pounder. From there, you'd have a 6-pounder, a 9, a 12, an 18, 24, and then a 32-pounder. The French system is a hair different, starting with a 4-pounder. Then you would have 6s, 8s, 12s, 18s, 24s, and 36-pounders. The other problem at hand is actually French pound and English pound, they're not the same weight to begin with. And so we find there's a fair amount of confusion as the bores of these guns would corrode as to what actual size, diameter, and weight of shot would actually fit on the inside. Now, it doesn't particularly matter, say if it's a French 4 or if it's an English 6-pounder. When you look at our cannon here, they all have the same parts. So when we say cannon, we are simply referring to the iron tube that fires the ammunition. Now, this is cast solid and then is bored out to form the cavity by which the ammunition is loaded. Out in front, you have the muzzle of the gun. The muzzle is the entrance to the bore, which goes all the way to the back of the gun, called the breech, where it is cast the thickest. And there's another hole called the vent, which is drilled from the top of the breech down into the bore. And this will allow the gunners to pour a priming charge of gunpowder to ignite the main charge on the inside. Now, just behind this, you have the cascabel, that little doorknob-like looking piece, which is used to help lift the gun up off of its carriage. Just ahead of the center of gravity of the cannon, you have 2 cylinders of iron called the trunnions. And these will allow, of course, the cannon to change in elevation and for it to rest upon its carriage. Now, all of the cannon that were mounted here at Ticonderoga in 1774 were English naval carriages, identifiable by the 4 small trucks or wheels. Now, if you look closely, you'll see the 2 cheeks of our carriage, or the large pieces of hardwood which right over the top in order to keep the cannon from popping off, say, when we fired the piece. Now, these cheeks, they're connected by a transit in the front and transit bolts to keep the whole thing together. And the cheeks, cannon and all, they rest upon two axle trees holding the forward trunks, with the small wheels which will allow the gun to recoil or to be moved in and out of battery. Now, if you look closely underneath the breech of the gun, there is the stool bed. The stool bed that holds the coin, or the aiming wedge, which when you pull out will increase the elevation, push it in, it decreases the elevation. Now, the vast majority of the artillery that was here in 1774 were either French 4-pounders or they were English 6-pounders. The problem at hand for the garrison is it was really difficult to tell the difference between the two because the odd system of measurements made the difference in the diameter of those two cannons only 1/4 of an inch. And due to the corrosion, the garrison had a hard time identifying which was which. Now, the ammunition that we've passed around here is the ammunition that is intended for the gun that we're going to fire. Here's a question to make sure y'all are paying attention. How much does that cannonball weigh? 4, exactly. And is it a French or an English 4? Exactly, because there is no English 4-pounder. Paying attention, that's great. Now, here's a slightly trickier question. At this point, the British Board of Ordnance had figured out that you need 1/3 the weight of your cannonball for a charge of gunpowder. The ammunition was carried within these paper cartridges. So, if we need 1/3 the weight of 4 pounds, how much does that weigh? 1 point something, you're right, but not quite right. What was that? Exactly, it's a repeating fraction. That's wonderful. Everyone gets that wrong. The rest of you. Now, there's one other thing, actually 2 other things you would need, and that is junk or wadding. Here at Ticonderoga, they employed a naval exercise referred to junk or wadding as an old heavy rope that only serves all the riggings of ships, which would be pulled apart and tied up into these little discs. The purpose of this was to push all the powder and the shot firmly to the breech of the gun so you didn't have a misfire. Now, imagine you've loaded our cannon with this concoction and you fired it with the maximum range in mind. You'd expect that cannonball to travel 1.7 miles. Even though it's a small gun, it's still some substantial range. But imagine the enemy is well within 1.7 miles. Let's say point-blank range, which for a gun like this is about 400 yards. You would switch over to a different kind of ammunition. In this case, grape shot. Now, for a 4-pounder, grape shot weighs how much? 4 pounds. Not a 6-pounder, it's a 4-pounder, exactly. But it's a little different. This time, instead of 1 cannonball, it is 9 iron balls, 1.25 in diameter, lashed around a central post, held within a hand. As you would imagine, when the gun is fired, that shot rips through the bag and sprays out towards the enemy down. Now, it would be the job of the Royal Artillery, men dressed as I am, to make and maintain all of this ammunition, which was kept within the southwest basket of the new powder magazine. Regrettably, notoriously leaky, and so quite the job for the men of the Royal Artillery Group. The other job that you would find them responsible for is training the drafts from the infantry how to actually operate this piece and to learn the tools associated. So you see the man who's standing to the front right of the gun, he carries the sponge rammer. Now that long haft has 2 cylinders of wood around either end, one of which has sheep's fleece tacked valve, which when plunged into a bucket of water wrung out, gives us the means of extinguishing any embers which might linger in the breech of the gun. The other cylinder, our rammer, pushes home our powder, our wad, our shot, and our other wad firmly up against the breech of the gun. Standing across from him is the man who carries the wad hook. Another haft, this time without the sheep's fleece, you've got that pointed piece of iron that is inserted into the gun immediately after it's fired, turned about a few times, ideally catching the remains of any paper cartridge which might be smoldering on the inside. And for redundancy's sake, a rammer at the other end. Now, to actually prime the piece, there are 2 tools. One of which is the priming iron. The other is the priming horn. The priming iron is used to push into the vent of the gun to break open the paper cartridge on the inside. The priming horn is filled ideally with about 2 pounds of fine gunpowder, which you then dispense into the vent via the brass sprout to actually prime the piece. To fire the gun, we have the lens stick, which holds slow match. Slow match is nothing more than a hemp rope that's been soaked in baths of wine spirits, sulfur, charcoal, just a little bit of gunpowder for touch. This creates a match that will burn very slowly, but when blown on, glows red hot once again. It is more than enough to touch off our charge of powder. All of the matrosses or gunners, they carry the chrome or hand spike, that simple machine or lever which amplifies the strength of the man, moving the gun in or out of battery, changing our elevation, and of course moving it from left to right. Now to put all this together, the Royal Artillery would train the drafts with His Britannic Majesty's exercise of the great guns and small arms. This exercise was last updated in 1765 and is actually a naval exercise. Now, why was the Army using a naval exercise? Well, if you look at our gun platform, our 4-pounder on a garrison carriage and its embrasure, it's a lot like a ship. Consequently, it was deemed to be the better exercise than the other ones. To begin this exercise, the first command is to take heed. Silence. Lay off the apron. Stop the touch hole. Handle sponge staff. So I place my thumb over the vent of the gun. This will help create a vacuum. The sponge staff is then inserted into the gun and then pulled out. And that sound you'll hear is the breaking of the vacuum. Handle cartridge. Now the ammunition is brought forward to the mouth of the gun. And that man waits for the next order to put it in the gun. Wad to your cartridge. Handle rammer. Ram home cartridge and wad. Unstop the touch hole, handle the priming iron, try if the cartridge be home. Now this is a safety measure to make sure the paper cartridge is in fact seated underneath the vent. If it's not, we'll have a misfire. I should be able to feel that cartridge with the vent. If it is there, I'll give the man up front the command to withdraw rammer, shot the gun. The rest of the ammunition, in this case the 4-pounder shot, is inserted into the muzzle. Wad, and the wad pushed on top. Ram home, shot and wad. Lay on the apron, run out the gun. Handle priming horn. Prime. Now to prime the piece, that priming iron is pulled out once again, this time pushed into the cartridge, and then the priming horn pours that fine gunpowder into the vent. Bruise the priming. The gunpowder is crushed slightly to make it more flammable. Secure the powder horn, lay on the apron, take up your crows and hand spikes. Point the gun to the object. Now that means aim. To aim, there are 2 different commands, one of which is a verbal command, either up or down to change the elevation. And then for confusion's sake, it is a simple hand gesture left or right. That way in the heat of battle, there is no confusion. Up, down. Lay down your crows and hand spikes. Take up your match and blow it. And if you have sensitive hearing, this is the loud part. Fire! Who wants to see it again? I see a couple hands. All right. Now, by doing this, of course, again and again and again, a gun crew can become proficient to do this in the heat of battle at a much, much faster rate. Spawning target, pardon me. Unstop the touch-hole handle priming iron. Drive the cartridge home. Withdraw rammer. Shot the gun. Wad. Ram home, shot and wad. Lay on the apron, run out the gun. Handle priming horn. Prime. Bruise the priming. Secure the powder horn. Take up your frozen hand spikes. Point the gun to the object. Lay down your frozen hand spikes. Take up your match and blow it. Now, it was in 1774 that Ticonderoga was once again becoming important to the British Army in North America. This was due to the growing unrest in the colony of Massachusetts and just across the lake in the Hampshire Grants. You would find that the British were once again waking up to Ticonderoga's importance. Consequently, they ordered an additional 200 men to bolster this garrison. However, these plans never came to light. The reason being was that Ticonderoga was in such deplorable shape that the garrison simply could not be enlarged. The engineer who came to survey the works noted that the walls were leaning towards the horizon and that there were many capital breaches. It is ironic that despite all the artillery that was present here, it did not make Ticonderoga more defensible, but instead made it the tempting target that it was even before the American Revolution. Of course, with these guns mounted, they could have been called into action with a simple command to fire! But of course would give America its first victory in the American Revolution. Now, with all that said, as soon as we're sure that our gun is safe, you guys are welcome to cross that safety line. Ask us any questions you may have. If you're curious about more artillery, I highly suggest you all take the exhibition tour, which will begin shortly within the parade ground.